Ladies and gentlemen, what an extraordinary privilege to be following Virginia's remarkable exposition, not just on the ability we have to come to the aid of people less fortunate than ourselves, but the enormous benefits that come out of teamwork, fundamental to which is communication. And I think the one thing that perhaps she didn't, through modesty, say loudly enough, and that is respect for the whole of the team. And it came through your delivery all the way down the line, right to the last pictures, respecting everybody who took part in that team as an essential part of the successful outcome. And I pay tribute to that. I think also in there was the ability to look ahead, to see the problems coming up and to plan for those, so that you're not just dealing with what's right in front of you, but you're dealing with the unforeseens as far as possible and getting ahead of those should they come, because being ready for disaster, if you like, is the best way to head it off or deal with it if it comes. And here we are, a small representative sample of the biggest mammal herd ever on the face of the planet. When I came onto the planet in 1944, there were 2.5 billion human beings, and it was rapidly growing. Now we have 7.2 billion, according to the latest UN figures, and we're headed for somewhere between 9 and 12 billion large marauding mammals in this herd before the best projections have us levelling off and then perhaps settling back into lower numbers somewhere next century or the century afterwards. And we know that this planet of ours is already being overtaxed by this herd. Witness the fact that we are using 120% of the world's renewable living resources. I repeat that, we're using 120% of the world's living renewable resources. That's why fisheries, 90% of the world's fisheries are collapsing. Forests are going backwards. There's a conference in this city I read in this morning papers next month about how to modulate the rapidly diminishing forests. And we're seeing the greatest rate of extinction of our fellow species on the planet since the dinosaurs were hapless victims of an asteroid from outer space smashing into the planet 65 million years ago. The thing is that on this occasion, it's not some unforeseen disaster, but it's one which is rapidly evolving with a very identifiable cause, and that's us, and a very identifiable cure, and that's us. And here we are in Australia, which UN figures show us is the richest, I'm talking in dollar terms here, the richest society on the face of planet Earth in 2014. We per capita are, in dollar terms, the richest people ever to have existed on the face of the planet. No one's ever matched it before. And yet, in the run to the federal election in September last year, in the last week, the government which was to win office promised the Australian people that if it were elected, it would take $4 billion out of foreign aid and put that into building more roads. We already had $26 billion set aside for roads, but they'd make it $30 billion. And this created a great deal of national attention, not least when Tim Costello said that that may effectively lead to some 400,000 to 500,000 infant deaths overseas through want of our Australian aid. Didn't make any difference. It gathered votes at a great rate. And we have to take a check on what it is that is going to turn us human beings from being greed-oriented, and Gandhi said that the planet has enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed, to a post-materialist age in which we are instead looking at the human wonderment of being on this planet and the ability of the biosphere to keep us. And in my own trajectory in life, I came from a medical background for which I'm eternally grateful, into what seems the hopeless triage situation of a planet which is going to be unable to withstand this pressure of humanity, and the greatest punishment from that inability is going to be upon our kith and kin coming up. And I very often say to business audiences and community groups and so on, we won't get it right until, and democracy's where it's at, ladies and gentlemen. There's, as Winston Churchill said in 1947, democracy is full of faults, but it's better than whatever else has been tried. And we have a choice in this age of massive weapons, and we see this happening around the world at the moment, of democracy or guns. And I, like you, am clearly in favour of the former. But democracy has to be global and raise the prospect of a planet on which everybody is equal, as is implemented through the ideal of one person, one vote, one value, one planet. And you'll instantly have Australians saying no to that, and I've tried it in the Australian Parliament and found that all other parties, except the one I represented, would vote against such a democratic ideal of seeing ourselves as a global community, in an age of global communications, where everybody has to be seen to at least able to aspire to a fair go and have their basic needs met, and be of equal voting power, at least, in the system of things, if we're going to make it into the future. Well, how did I get into dealing with what we often deny is the global situation facing humanity, and it's coming at us like a train rush, rather than doing something more comfortable? Well, I have the best to say on that is by accident. I was a young doctor who was troubled enough to think about suicide when I was shortly after graduation, because I was gay and I was Presbyterian, and it's not a very good mix, particularly in a community in which homosexual behaviour was at those times punishable by 20 years in jail. We got rid of the death penalty, but it was still there, and lots of young people were reading it in the papers all the time. Young men, this is, were being hauled off to jail simply for, well, there was a young fellow in Launceston who said, I was 21 and the police arrived at the door and said, who lives here with you? And he said, my friend David here, who's 21. They said, where do you sleep? And they looked around the house, one bed. They were taken off to jail. They had no legal representation. They were brought before the court and both given 3 years in jail. And you can imagine what a disruption to their lives that was. Now, that's 1958, and by 1970 things hadn't altered very much, except for Don Dunstan getting rid of the criminal sanctions on homosexuality over in South Australia. So I, rather than take a one-way swim on Lake Burley Griffin, I was at this time working as an RMO at Canberra Community Hospital. By the way, I have very memorable experiences of the 100 to 120 hours a week worked in the intensive care unit at that hospital while I was there. But we had, fortunately, a great team of RMOs who looked after each other as best we could. This is the year in which people first walked on the moon. The following year I bought a ticket and went to London, and it was a breakout. I ran into people who felt differently, and I started to think that I should just be my natural self as far as sexuality is concerned. But the Cold War was on, and here we had the most brilliant people on the planet, either in Kazakhstan, in the USSR as it was then, or in Grand Forks, Idaho in the US, getting ready to press a button in a nuclear war. The Cold War was on in full, and I stood in Piccadilly Circus and wondered how the hell we could have got to this stage where our greatest brilliance was being used for an ultimate showdown in which everybody would lose. I came back to Australia, worked my way back on a ship, and found a job in Launceston. I wanted to go there because I'd seen on black and white television that Lake Pedder, one of the most gently beautiful wild places on the planet, was being destroyed for a pittance of hydroelectricity. And I'd also read about the Tasmanian tiger, the fabled tiger, the last of which died in the Hobart Zoo on the 7th of September 1936. And remember, this is less than 36 years after that. So I went to Launceston and joined the practice there, and bought a little house out under the mountains in Tasmania, and from there everything's been on the up and up. I did get a call one night as I was asleep. I used to go into Launceston practice. I lived 50 kilometres out in the bush, and I'd cycle in on Friday afternoons. It was a 3-person practice. They'd go home and I'd look after the practice for Saturday morning to see 50 or so patients, and then through the weekend on call on my bicycle and back out to home on Monday with a sack full of goods. And one night I was just getting to sleep at 11 o'clock and the phone rang, and an anxious mother on the phone said she was worried that her 18-year-old had a pain and had appendicitis. And I asked her when this had begun, and she said, well, 11 o'clock or so this morning. So I chided her about having not called me during the day, hopped on the bicycle and went up to the housing estate to see what could be done for this young fellow. All the lights had been shot out in the street, catapults or air guns, I'm not sure, but the street was in darkness. And at the home at which I was aiming, there was a shaft of light coming out an open door with a young fellow slumped in the doorway. So I grabbed my bag, hopped the fence, and went to see this man who looked slightly older than the 18 that his mother, who had gone to bed, had told me. So, and I could smell alcohol. And I got him to lie on the floor just inside the nearest room and did a quick examination. The salient thing being that his dad had died 3 months earlier of a heart attack, and he was anxious. He was drunk, and his pain was here, not down here, as I had expected if his mother was correct. So I reassured him and told him he'd be okay. He was fine, he was fit, and he wasn't going to die of a heart attack like his father. Whereupon he held out a bankroll of notes to me and said, Dr. Brown, you're the best bloody doctor in Launceston. I called all the other doctors and they didn't come, and I didn't call you and you did come. I'm supposed to be across the road in a different house. So I hopped the fence and went across the road to the darkened house where the boy did have appendicitis and sent his mother off, sent him off to hospital while I had a cup of tea with his mother before going back home. That was one of the memorable periods of my very short medical career, because shortly after that I was asked by a bearded forester if I'd float down Tasmania's wild Franklin River. I hadn't heard of it. He couldn't get anybody else to do it. So I said, well, if you go walking in the mountains with me and friends in January 1976, I'll float down the river with you on rubber duckies. We did that, 10 days of seeing no other human beings, but great canyons, waterfalls tumbling down the walls of some of them, sea eagles floating across large inland fjords, platypuses coming up between our rafts, leatherwood petals floating on the darkened tannin-stained waters of this totally untouched last great wild river in southern Australia. And we got to the end of that in 10 days and went round the corner and here were helicopters, jackhammers, explosions going off and adits up in the gorge walls on the Gordon River, and the anchorage being made for a dam which was to flood everything that we had just witnessed. And I went back to the surgery and decided I'd put all my money into the handful of environmentalists, greenies, who were trying to stop this dam. I found that wasn't enough, and very shortly afterwards left the practice to replace a burnt-out greenie to become director of the Wilderness Society. And it struck me, this is a shorthand of it, but it struck me that in the practice where I'd been, half, if not more, of the people were there with symptoms coming from the anxiety of modern life: hypertension, stomach ulcers, skin rashes, you know. And here we were about to destroy for a pittance of electricity and profitability one of the greatest resources left for ameliorating human anxiety, and that is the natural fabric of this planet. And it is a massively important medical consideration for the health of the 7.2 billion people who now on this earth do dwell. We have evolved or been created in the wild planet Earth, which so far as we know is the only planet amongst trillions in the universe which has life, let alone consciousness and the ability to alter its circumstances. That's us. And yet we are bonded to that natural living fabric of the planet in a way which is critically important to our psychological and physical well-being. And it's the fastest disappearing natural resource on the planet. It's being destroyed at an accelerating rate here in 2014. To give a simple highlight or cameo of this, we don't give our loved ones, as a sign of affection and delight and regard for them, a chainsaw or even a toy bulldozer. We hand them a bunch of flowers. Now really, when you think of that, why is that? It's because the colour and smell and delight of flowers and the sign of resurgent life after winter has been with us human beings throughout our millions of years of pre-existence, if you like, evolution on the planet. It's why we put window boxes of flowers in our windows in the most densely populated places on the planet. And it's why we like to go for a Sunday picnic, if we can, to the nearest woods or stream, particularly with our children. There is an ineffable bond between us and the natural planet, and yet that natural planet, which is priceless, is devalued to nothing. Indeed, it is priceless in this age where economics is all that counts. In the political world in which I've spent the last 30 years, and the media which covers it. And wealth and growth in wealth is seen as a sign of human well-being rather than happiness, as the Bhutanese would have it, and the security of soul, the security of our fealty with the planet and with each other, which is irreplaceable but central to the health of the whole of our society and absolutely critical to our own individual well-being, is the security of knowing we're living with 7 billion other human beings who feel rested and at peace and don't want to attack us. And we haven't got that at the moment. And we'll only get it when we extend the principle of one person, one value to everybody on one planet, because we now, as from here on in, share a common destiny with everybody else on the planet. And in particular, when we see what we do through the eyes of those who come after us. And over every parliament and every office And every college around the planet should be the words, will people 100 years from now thank us for what we're doing? And if we can't say yes to that, we shouldn't be doing it. Or if we're doubtful about it, we ought not be doing it. And there is a dearth of leadership on the planet in steering us away from the ultimate disaster of fighting this out. And I wonder very often whether we are post-catastrophe critters, mammals, whether we cannot apply our intelligence before catastrophe to avoid it. And that's the critical question that we all face on Earth in this most critical century that humanity has ever come to, because it's the first one in which we really have to sort things out on a global scale. I was in the Tasmanian Parliament in 1987 as an independent Green and was approached by some very wise folk and put forward legislation to ban semi-automatic machine guns, which were becoming far too available in Tasmanian society. Allow guns to farmers and to police and a few sports persons, but restrict them from being generally available in society. And the Hansard of me introducing this legislation is with Dr. Brown interjections from the other side of the chamber, interjections. I was howled down. And 7 years later, at Port Arthur in Tasmania, a man took a couple of these guns and shot to death 35 men, women and children, and maimed a lot of other people in the process. And within 3 months of that Port Arthur massacre, that legislation was taken out of the drawer and became national legislation. And you'll remember, many of you who are Australians, our Prime Minister in a bulletproof vest announcing to the still hostile purveyors of guns that we were going to have an amnesty on guns, withdraw semi-automatic machine guns and limit them to only essential use. And since that legislation's been brought through, you can look at the number of deaths from massacres and shootings going down, and we know that hundreds and hundreds of Australians are alive today because of that legislation. But it took a catastrophe to bring it in. And the question is it going to take a human catastrophe on a world in which we're already using 120% of the living renewable resources of the planet before we use our God-given, if you like, evolved intelligence to ward that off? And this requires, in a democratic system, us using our nous, and that requires us employing, I think, the question as we go to the ballot box, will our grandchildren thank me for voting this way? And if we can't say that, then I think we're failing the future of the planet. And it's a matter of fact that in September last year, 90% of Australians who voted Labor, Liberal or PUP voted for 6 mega coal ports inside the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland, which is a massive threat to a reef which is going to be half ruined now since 1960, is going to be fully ruined by the end of this century if we don't stop burning fossil fuels and acidifying the ocean as another result of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. But instead, those parties are in favour of the Galilee Basin in Queensland, which is the world's biggest single coal deposit being opened, and through those 6 ports, enough coal being exported to the rest of the planet and burnt to triple the output of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere of current Australian use, and we're amongst the world's greatest polluters per capita of the planetary system. That is the atmosphere. And yet, people didn't want to have those 6 mega coal ports. They simply voted for the immediate promise of less taxes and leadership improvement to the detriment of the long-term interests of the planet. It was put aside in consideration, and it's not until we put it at the front in consideration that we'll be dealing with the most seriously threatened patient of all which is the biosphere upon which we human beings depend, although it doesn't depend on us at all. And the greatest question confronting all of us as a community is how we will deal with patient Earth, its living biosphere, which is rapidly losing all the parameters of persistence which we need if it's going to go on healthily into the future, and therefore to maintain our human presence on this planet as, if we got it right, we would do in the prelude to an exploration of the universe and what it is that our presence here on this delightful and beautiful planet of ours means. And yet, let me give you a few other indicators of the ill health of the system which currently governs things. One of those is that it took Sea Shepherd. I became chair of Sea Shepherd after I left the Senate, and you'll know Sea Shepherd is headed up by Paul Watson, this rather rambunctious but very intelligent character who says, I don't take my instructions from anybody except the great whales, as they go south each year to intervene on the Japanese whale-killing factory ship and its attendant harpoon ships with their grenade-tipped harpoons coming from near Tokyo each year to maraud these great fellow mammals of ours, these warm-blooded cousins of humanity, which went back into the ocean some millions of years ago and have a right to feed peaceably after they come to the Australian coastline, where the great nurseries are east and west on our coastline for these great mammals. But they've been, Sea Shepherd this is, in defending the whales, has been called pirates, criminals, and a lot worse. The World Court ruled at the start of this year that in fact that wasn't the case. It was the Japanese killing of those fish, those mammals, the great fishes, as the Bible would have it, but the mammals, which is illegal. And yet the Australian Federal Court had already jumped that in 2009, ruled that the Japanese whaling in the international sanctuary to the south of Australia was illegal and issued an injunction. It was immediately and promptly ignored by the whale-killing fleet coming south the following summer, and nothing happened. If you or I were to flout a federal court ruling, we would be in jail pronto. But there are important trade considerations in this age of materialism and dollar rules with Tokyo, which got in the way. And so no policing episode of the whales in defence of this Australian court ruling was invoked, and it was left to Sea Shepherd. And now there's been an international ruling that the whaling is illegal, and Sea Shepherd has been vindicated. Prime Minister Abe from Japan said in both Australia and New Zealand earlier this year, or followed up a statement that they would resume whaling next year. Prime Minister Key in New Zealand chided Mr Abe and said that's not what New Zealanders want. But when he came to Canberra, nothing was said by Prime Minister Abbott at all. And I have a little film here. It's just a 4-minute clip of Paul Watson, who's shown extraordinary leadership and been vilified, and continually is vilified, because he works by a simple rule, which is the living planet is something that's critical for humanity and for itself, and I will defend it. And the people who go with him, showing enormous courage, getting no financial reward at all. In fact, they're not paid, and to boot, they're all vegans, so they are quite an extraordinary lot. This little film is talking about that leadership of a person who has a goal in mind. Leadership always requires stating the goal and sticking to it, and that is to end the bloody business of killing the great whales in the world's ocean in this age in which we should be doing so much better, and we don't need any of the products coming from killing those whales. So, Operation Relentless.
I think that the Ninth District Court injunction emboldened the whalers, and they were much more aggressive this year. I think that they felt they could do whatever they wanted, and they had the backing of both the Japanese government and the U.S. courts. In the past, the Nishan Maru has tried to hit us, but we've been able to certainly get out of their way. But this time we were holding our positions to prevent the refueling, and so, I think they probably thought they could bluff us and we'd just move aside, and then when we didn't, they were in a position where they just carried on and hit the vessels. I think that an 8,000-ton vessel striking a 500-ton vessel and pushing it into a 5,000-ton vessel creates a very dangerous situation. The Bob Barker was almost capsized because the Nishan Maru was pushing it over to such a degree. A few more minutes, it probably would have capsized. That would have been an extremely serious situation. I don't think the Japanese captain really cared. In all of these campaigns, the crew are under the understanding that there are inherent dangers, that we're not just saying we're coming down here to risk our lives to protect the whales, we actually are risking our lives to protect the whales. And when putting our ships in a position to block their operations, we mean that we're there to block their operations. Now, there's no point in saying you're going to stand fast if you move out of the way at the last moment. If you're going to say you're going to stand fast, then you stand fast.
Sea Shepherd Australia, which is now, through legal attacks in the US courts, which is now responsible for the future defence of the whales to our south, has established its operation headquarters at Williamstown here in Melbourne. And you're welcome to go and see the wonderful folk who are preparing the ships right now to head south in November. And they have an open day before they go in November, and everybody, of course, is welcome to that. As for Paul Watson, he's not allowed into this country, because if he comes here, he has no assurance he won't be handed to the Japanese courts, and they want to put him into solitary confinement for 15 years at least, and there's 99% conviction rate in the Japanese courts, because he's got in the way of their commerce, which is making dollars, subsidised dollars, and they diverted, by the way, 28 million from the International Tsunami Fund into refurbishing the Nishan Maru for that particular trip to make dollars for people who want to continue on the whale killing business in Japan. Nearer home, here in Melbourne, just to the north of Melbourne, are the Yarra Ranges, and in those ranges is the last of the tallest forest ever on the planet. These magnificent mountain ash eucalypt forests, the greatest flowering forests, were measured at up to 134 metres. The great sequoias in redwoods in California, now the tallest trees on Earth, 115 metres. But there's trees regrowing out there in the Yarra Ranges at 90 metres and heading back up towards 130 metres, but they're down to 1% of their natural extent. And in those trees, when they get to over 100 years, is this little possum. It's called a pygmy possum. It's got an angelic face and it's headed for extinction within 20 years, according to the greatest world expert, David Lindenmayer at ANU, if we don't stop destroying its habitat, which is these great trees. Down to 1%, and yet on November the 29th there'll be election in Victoria, and how many people will think as they walk up to the election box that in voting for any of the big parties you're voting for that destruction of the habitat and therefore the extinction of this species and these great forests will be of importance. And tomorrow I'll be holding a press conference which shows that while people ostensibly won't vote to protect the forests and the possums, in fact, by a 5-to-1 majority, they want that outcome. And the question here is, where do we put and when will we put the health of the living biosphere of which we are a part and upon which we're utterly dependent at the forefront of our thinking when we go to the ballot box? Well, they're not going to allow environment and the health of the planet to get in the way of making a dollar. And we all depend on a healthy economy. I agree with that. But it doesn't depend on exploiting the limited resources of this planet without paying for the cost of such things as atmospheric pollution. And in my home state of Tasmania, after the Franklin campaign, we've run a long campaign to protect great forests like those in Victoria, including the Tarkine rainforest, which is the largest temperate rainforest in Australia and is a direct cousin because we were joined together 65 million years ago in the Gondwana supercontinent with South America and New Zealand. It's a direct cousin of the New Zealand fiordland forest and those in Patagonia. In fact, we share species of the same trees, which back there before 65 million years ago were all being fodder for those dinosaurs, which after the catastrophe went to extinction. Anyway, in Tasmania, these forests are now being cut towards their own extinction. And people will not give up wanting to protect them. People have a love of the natural planet, which is why we all want to watch David Attenborough and get our kids to watch that in preference to almost anything else on television. And yet when it comes to it, it's in a parlous situation. If we can't, in the richest country on the planet, go to its aid, who will? Last month, the lower house of the Tasmanian Parliament passed legislation that if you stand peacefully in front of a chainsaw going to destroy ancient forests full of rare and endangered species like the Tasmanian devil, the native quoll, the giant Tasmanian wedge-tailed eagle, which has got a wingspan of up to 3 metres. I'm stretching to 2 metres here, down to some hundreds of pairs. The white goshawk, which is fewer in numbers still. The swift parrot, which is the fastest parrot on Earth and has just arrived at our home. My partner Paul's here with me today. He's a sheep farmer and we live down south of Hobart at the moment. This little bird was in great flocks when Europeans arrived in Australia. It's now down to 1,000 breeding pairs, and the problem for it is it feeds on the mainland in winter and goes to Tasmania in summer to breed, and the forests where it goes to breed are being cut from under it. No forest, no nests. No nests, no birds. This little bird, by the way, it takes you all night on the ferry to go to Tasmania, and I'd welcome anybody to come down and have a look at the Tarkine rainforest, for example, while they're there, because to go to look at it is to want to do something about it. These birds don't take all night. They cross Bass Strait in 3 hours. And we want them for future generations to enjoy as much as ourselves to enjoy now. Well, if you go to stand in front of a bulldozer after this legislation, which has gone through the lower house and will go through the upper house later this month, it will be a mandatory penalty, minimum $5,000. There is no mandatory penalty in Tasmania for child molestation or for murder. If you do it a second time and go back and stand peaceably in defence of life-filled forests in Tasmania, after this legislation passes, it's a mandatory 3 months minimum in jail. You see, what's happening is, as the natural planet upon which our health and well-being depends becomes less, and therefore of higher money in an age of materialism to destroy, those who have the lobbying power on parliaments full of weak-spined politicians are managing to get the penalties for those who would go to the defence of the planet and therefore the health and well-being of all species, but in particular us human beings into the future of this planet. The penalties are being raised. It's a perverse outcome of a philosophy of materialism, and I can't wait till we get to the post-materialist age. But here's the question for an ex-senator like me. I'm a bird out of the cage. I'm back into environmental activism. I've set up this Bob Brown Foundation. It's not a superannuation fund for me. It's a foundation to go to the aid of impecunious greenies and environmental campaigners who need assistance when they won't get it from anybody else. And I'll be there to stand in front of those bulldozers and face the $5,000 fine, and I'll be there with them, the bright-eyed youngsters who are going to come to the defence of these planets, the doctors, the nurses, the health professionals for the planet, who are going to be there to defy these laws when they go to jail. Because we have to peaceably stand in defence of this planet's ecosystem if we're going to be dinkum about the health of all people who come after us, let alone our fellow species on this planet. It's a challenging time, but it's great to be alive. I'm an optimist because I tried pessimism and it doesn't work. Pessimism knocks you out, optimism gets you going. We don't know what the future of the planet will be, but I am sure of this. Being optimistic about the intelligence of humanity prevailing and us together, maybe it'll take some shocks and some disasters, being able to turn around this current age of destruction and get to a new sustainable age where humanity lives with the planet instead of just off it, can come about if we only use this cranium, which we have. And optimism works in business. I can't see why it won't work in the business of saving the planet, so that those who come after us will be grateful to us rather than full of chagrin about the way we wasted away their opportunity, their planet, their healthfulness and their hopes for the future. It's great to be alive. I've written an Earth song, and I'll finish with that because there is no anthem for this planet unless you take Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World, and what a great song that is. I wrote this when I was 16. I want to show it to you. Claire Dawson, who came off out of Birmingham and onto the West End in London, she came very sensibly to Tasmania to raise her family. She lives just down the road from us at Eggs and Bacon Bay. Yeah, that's the name of the place. And she's singing this in Paul's sheep paddock just quickly before I got this video put together. But in it are pictures taken from drones of the Tarkine rainforest. That which is at stake, and that's which they are raising the penalties against us defending into the future. But if we're going to really get into the joy of having made sure the planet's there for the future, it begins with celebrating the planet now. If we're going to be effective campaigners or workers for any great cause, we need to look after ourselves, stop to celebrate that which we're working for, and enjoy it with our kith and kin. So here's a song to the planet. We've got one for every country. Why not for planet Earth?
This is a planet, life's only cradle, warmed by the sunlight, it gave us birth. And in the morning, sun to our window, that magic feeling alive on earth. Eagles are soaring above the mountains, whale songs are sounding deep in the sea, and in Earth's cities wilderness flowers offer devotion, set spirits free. Wonderful planet, life's revelation, a sunlit garden, wild rivers fall, a one and only home in the universe, this speck of splendor. Earth is our own. Now here's a promise, our obligation to all the people who breathe this air. Your world is our world is your world, safe in our keeping, sure in our care. Wonderful planet, life's revelation, a sunlit garden, while the rivers fall, a one and only home in the universe, this speck of splendor. Earth is our own.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. Bob's kindly agreed to take a few questions if there's any questions or comments from the audience. But I'd like to start, Bob. In intensive care, we channel resources, a lot of resources, into small numbers of people. What's our professional role in the paradigm shift that you're advocating?
Well, look, and Virginia outlined that problem with the twins. But I'm in favour of us doing what we can where we can, and also dealing with the problem in hand. Say to young people, young school kids, the most often question I get asked is, Bob, why aren't you depressed? Because they're looking at the world and what's happening in Syria and the Ukraine and everywhere, and they feel it's just all too hard. And I say to them, well, because I've put the problems I can't deal with on the shelf and deal with those in hand. You might say, what a wasted resource. He's a doctor, he should be back in practice and so on. But I'm doing what I love, as you are, and it makes such a difference. And if it's going to be expensive to be at the forefront of leading technology, dealing with a problem in hand, there is a flow-on effect. If you ask me, would I be in favour of spending money on technology for further developing handbag-sized nuclear weapons? No, I'm not. I don't go along with that. If you ask me if I'm in favour of developing technology which will, as we saw from Virginia's presentation, oh, thank God for the innovators, the team, the technological nous, the wonder of human creativity, as that is not only developed here but flows onto the onto the planet. Mind you, if you ask me, why on earth did we vote to take $4 billion out of foreign aid at last year's election, I have to say, oh, we've got to do better as a people. We've got to be more thoughtful than that.
Thank you. Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for that fantastic talk. I realise you had to retire at some stage, but it's very sad because I think you had more integrity in your little finger than the rest of Parliament combined. But My question, I've got teenage kids, and while they do have a lot of faults, one thing, they do seem to have a bit more appreciation of conservation. They seem to be a bit less money-driven, and respect gay rights and all that. And they just don't see the problem that the older generation have had. And do you think that offers any hope for the future?
Yes, I do. People tell me that young people are only interested in shopping, and it's not my experience at all. Everywhere I go, and in this country, New Zealand, Asian countries, in the Americas, Europe, everywhere, I find bright-eyed youngsters who know what's going on the planet and want to put it right. It's life's like a moving footway to me. As you get towards the end, you're going to have to step off, and it's a bit daunting. Until you turn around and see the bright-eyed young people stepping on at the other end. And human life, like all species on this planet, is a flow. We're handing the baton, taking the baton and handing it on to other generations. And I'm terrifically delighted with just the knowledge that people like us will be sitting around in 50 or 50,000 years from now, if we get it right, discussing what on earth we're doing here, what a fantastic planet this is, all the others we've gone to visit, by the way, in the meantime, and what life is all about, and the joy of it, and the creativity of human beings. And young people fill me with inspiration. And that poll, by the way, that shows that Victorians by 5 to 1 want a great national park in the Yarra Ranges to the north of here to protect the pygmy possum. When you get to the 24 to 18-year-olds, it's 11 to 1. Young people are the hope of the planet, and we've got, I would be like the Scots and lower the voting age to 16 pronto. I tried it, but they didn't. The rest of the Parliament didn't vote for it.
Bob, we've got a few minutes left, and I'd like to ask you, you alluded to it earlier in your presentation that there's something about being a medical student and a doctor that somehow equipped you in a way for your subsequent endeavours. What tangible aspects did you take forward from that time of your life?
Well, I was very shy as a young doctor, but I also was very earnest about the responsibility. And one thing I learnt was self-management, and that period in ICU at Canberra Community Hospital, as it was then, taught me that. It was no good working yourself to the point where you couldn't think. And also the importance of teamwork. I didn't learn how to put a stitch into a cut at medical school, 6 years at the University of Sydney. I'm sure they're brilliant at it now. But I found no indignity at all. In fact, a great pleasure in asking the nurse at the outpatients to show me how to do it. Learning the ability to ask whoever's around, whatever their title, was to give you the knowledge you don't have yourself is very important to teamwork. And the other thing I learnt was in discussing a problem, you had to take everybody into account and fully acquaint them with it. And that became and listening. Don't listen to the person who's sitting over there, but you're telling them instead of listening. Big mistake, because as we all know, you'll miss something. They want to shyly tell you some intimate detail that's critically important to diagnosis, and if you're not in a listening mode, you won't get there. Very, very important. But when it came to, I'd learnt to listen and to communicate and to consult, and by the time I got to the Franklin campaign, I knew as director of this burgeoning wilderness society, which was headed for a showdown on the Franklin River where 1,500 people were arrested for peaceably standing in front of bulldozers in a campaign that led to Australians voting out the government that was allowing the dam and voting in a government in 1983 that stopped it, was to have a lunch every day. Somebody rostered to go up the road, buy the bread, the butter, the peanut butter, bananas, tomatoes, and put on the lunch, and everybody in the building came and had lunch. And at that lunch, I would tell everybody who's working there what the latest opinion poll was, what the latest thing from the Prime Minister was, what the Financial Review had to say that morning. And we all kept informed, and they'd feed back what was happening in their plans to hide food stashes down by the river, ready for this blockade, or a phone call that came in the middle of the night from a mysterious woman saying that the bulldozers are going to move in next Tuesday morning. anonymous phone calls, a great source of reliable information, and so on. Being part of that team is just the joy of it. Taking the responsibility of being in some way a leader who has to make decisions on one's own is a bad choice. Been forever grateful to have been through medical school and to learn to deal with people who are having a hard time, because if you can deal with that, you can much better deal with people who are having an easy time, including very hard-headed, belligerent, bullying people, not always men, but very often in society, who are going to have their way regardless and get out of my way. They have to be stood up to, because invariably, if you run into a personality like that, they're not right.
Thanks, Bob. We can probably retrain you, get you a gig as a resident in the ICU at the Austin if you can. Bob.
Bob Wright, Sydney. I'm just thinking that when I listen to your talk, at times people can go overboard in demonstrating. And I worry about your friend Watson, because fair enough if he wants to make a point, but he's going around in his boat deliberately at times trying to ram the Japanese boat in very dangerous, icy cold waters. And I think this sort of behaviour is reprehensible, and I just wonder what you think about it.
Bob, is it?
Yes.
I think you've been reading the Murdoch media. There's nothing in that film, or anything that I know. Sea Shepherd has never, ever rammed anybody.
He's tried to.
He may have in some past operations, but as far as I'm concerned, and I've been chair of the board of Sea Shepherd through these last 2 years, there's been no such operation. But let me put it this way. The question might better have been asked, how dare now the World Court has found them illegal, these giant ships of 12,000 and 8,000 tonnes, whale killers, ram a citizen's boat of 800 tonnes down there to uphold the law and the peace? That's the question.
I think a lot of seafarers would disagree with you, and they feel this man is acting in an irresponsible way. And if you're advising him, I'd say, look, demonstrate, but do it in a safe sort of way.
That's exactly...
And don't go taking a rubber dinghy under the bows of boats and all that sort of thing, which is what he's been doing.
Yeah, I appreciate your point of view, but I'm a policeman's son and a policeman's grandson, and I come from a long line of them, and one thing I know is you see the law being broken, whether it's laws of nature or the laws of human society, and you stand aside and hold the placard while that law is broken under your nose, and whales have grenade-tipped harpoons shot into their spines, mothers in front of calves and vice versa, and do nothing more than hold a protest. You become a protest sign up, as they want us to do in Tasmania. Don't get in the way of the chainsaw, just stand to the side with a placard. You become part of the problem, not part of the answer. We would not have women voting and in such a growing, and look at Virginia's presentation, if we hadn't had women who were prepared to not only stand up but on occasions to break the law of the time. The same with the people who abolished slavery or got kids out of mines into schools. It sometimes takes extraordinary courage to do that. I am against violence of any sort, but to standing defiantly in the way of violence coming against the natural realm of this planet when we all need it so badly is to me a good thing. We all have to make up our own mind about that, as long, Bob, as those people who believe you should simply hold a protest sign go down to Federation Square and hold the protest sign in defence of those who are saving the whales or the forests or the biosphere or the air we breathe.
Hi Bob, my name's Luke Torrey, and thank you for the talk. And look, I think many people, and I do agree with many of the principles that you've talked about, and the protection of the planet and of humanity, and they really are wonderful attributes, and we need to all do more. You're right. You're absolutely right, and we're all guilty of not doing enough. I suppose I just wanted to give feedback as a voter who looks at the Greens sometimes and the other parties. And I suppose the thing that I've always completely struggled with the Greens is that you have a policy of protecting humanity and protecting nature and the environment, but at the same time promote abortion and defend euthanasia. And as a doctor, that's very difficult because I see human beings as certainly part of humanity and part of nature. And I just wondered how you sit justifying those two things, standing there and saying to protect the environment and humanity, but condoning abortion and euthanasia.
Thank you. It's a very important ethical question, and we have to just simply make up our own minds. The majority of Australians favour both, and every opinion poll since the 1980s has shown 80% of people want to have euthanasia for people who are terminally ill and have no escape from that, and who are finding a terrible end to their lives. Again, it's up to us as individuals to make up our own minds, not to have it imposed by somebody else. And I wouldn't take away your right to have your life with or without abortion and without euthanasia being an option. And I beg you, sir, not to impose your thinking on me. But at the moment, when it comes to euthanasia, the fact is 80% of Australians want that option, although global practice is that only 1% would ever use it if it were available. But our parliaments will routinely vote it down because the 20% have the lobbying power that the 80% don't have. It's an interesting ethical question, and I think we could have a very long and endless debate and not change each other's mind on that. And we just have to accept that, each for our own. Let's take our own options.
We've got time for one more question.
Thank you, Bob. I'm Jeff Shaw. I am a citizen of both Australia and New Zealand. What impresses me most is your lack of fear. You didn't have fear asking a nurse to help you, to teach you to stitch someone up. You didn't have fear of coming out as being gay. You're not fearful of standing in front of chainsaws. In fact, what really impresses me, and one question I have to ask you, is how did you manage to conquer that fear? Because I know that I probably couldn't stand in front of a chainsaw, and I couldn't stand on the Sea Shepherd and be crushed between two ships. I wouldn't do that, and most people won't do that. So what is special about you, and how have you managed to conquer those fears?
Thank you. Well, I'm a frightened person, I have to tell you. And the two times that I remember immediately where my heart almost, the adrenaline pump in my heart almost beat outside my chest, was when I was hidden in a bunch of cutting grass in the southwest wilderness in Tasmania, where pro-logging vigilantes came with guns out of all windows and a hunting dog in the back and a searchlight and shone it on that grass. And I knew that if they saw me there, I was done for. They fortunately didn't. They went off and burnt cars and things in the night instead. The second time was I was in the Parliament, and President George W. Bush came from the United States to talk about, to thank our Prime Minister Howard for helping engage in the invasion of Iraq. And I waited till he spoke about Iraq and got up and said, President Bush, if you abide by the laws of the world, then the world will respect you and free 2 Australians from Guantanamo Bay as you freed the 2 Americans. As I was getting to my feet at that stage in his speech, and the whole place was galvanised by the President's speech, my heart almost, I felt, oh no, I'm going to fail. But I didn't, and I copped it after that, but then the letters came in. And let me just finish with the observation of Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher, who said the trouble with the world is that the ignorant are cocksure and intelligent people are full of self-doubt. And what I found after that speech presentation was I got nooses, white powder in envelopes, Alan Jones and others saying I should be taken out to sea and dumped and punched in the face, etc. And then a little while later, people coming in with letters saying thank you for speaking up when President Bush was in town. I guess I recognise I'm just a leaf on the stream. I'm here, as we were talking about earlier, and will be gone soon, like all of us. I love life. I love human beings. And when I think all that out and realise my own inconsequence, it's easier to be a little bit forward in standing in front of chainsaws and so on. We're lucky in this country, and every time I do that, I think about the mothers and fathers in the city being surrounded by ISIS at the moment in Syria, or the people struggling to get across the desert to find water for the kids they've got on their arms, or the youngsters who were dropped out of helicopters at the time of the Franklin campaign over the Rio Plate in Argentina because they dared to stand up against the junta of the day. We got it so easy in Australia, and we just are far too backward in being forward when it matters. And the older I get, the less shy I become.
Thank you.
On that note, thank you very much, Bob.